What is happening, everybody? It's time to break down another UFC slate. This weekend, we've got Blanchfield taking on Fiorot in the main event. I'm going to break down everything that you need to know to make some money playing DFS this weekend. As you're watching, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you're looking to sign up for the tools at Stokastic.com, in particular, our Sims tool for MMA, there's a link for that below in the description box. That is going to give you all the tools that you need to build your lineups, to simulate out the slate, but then also grants you access to our Discord channel. So if you ever have any questions you want to ask me, whether it's leading up to the slates or you just want to hang out while we're sweating the slates, you sign up for a package at Stokastic, you get access to the Discord as well. And the Sims, they've been crushing this year. They've helped me be really profitable at MMA DFS. And hopefully we've got another positive slate coming up for us to all make some money this weekend as well. Also, giveaway. Last weekend, we did a giveaway in the comment section, whichever person could guess which fighter would be the highest scoring for DraftKings purposes. We win a free month of Odd Shopper. That is our sports betting product. And YouTube Streets official guessed Edmund Shabazian, who ended up scoring, it was, I think, 118.5 points is the highest scorer. So YouTube Streets official, you're the winner for this week. Send me a DM over on Twitter, and I could send you the link to get you your free subscription Odd Shopper, and we'll run it back again this week. I've liked doing these. I think it's fun. So this week, let's do it a little bit different, though. Which fighter do you guys think is going to score the least fantasy points this week? Which fighter is going to have the lowest total DraftKings points? Let me know below in the comment section, and whoever gets the low ball winner this week, you also going to get a free subscription. If there are any ties, then I'll randomize it to pick the winner. But that's going to be the giveaway for this week. So just let me know below in the comment section who's going to be the lowest scorer on DraftKings this week. But let's start breaking down the slate. And I did have my exposures all there on screen from the Sims tool. I'll be referencing those over the course of the show. But I like having those up there just so you guys can look at it and see where I'm at with some of these fights. But let's start with the main event. Blanchfield taking on Fiorot. And there's been a crazy amount of line movement for this fight. And to an extent, I understand it. I just think it's too aggressive. So when the fight opened up at close to a pick'em, I thought that was more or less accurate, although I did slightly favor Blanchfield. Just typically, I do tend to favor the wrestler and grapplers over strikers in the wrestler and grappler matchup. But to me, this line is starting to get out of hand. We now have Fiorot nearly a plus 200 underdog. You could bet her upwards of like plus 175 or so at the time that I'm recording. And it's something that I am planning to bet. I'm just waiting to see if the line moves a little bit more, but anything plus 170 or better, I'm willing to bet on Fiorot because I do think this matchup is a little bit tighter than what the line indicates. As far as fantasy goes, there's more upside in the Blanchfield side because if she wins, it's going to come from wrestling and grappling, but Fiorot's the much better striker in this matchup, and we've seen that's a hole in Blanchfield's game. In her last fight against Talia Santos, pull up some stats here, Blanchfield ultimately ends up winning the fight, but she went 0 for 14 on takedown attempts. A lot of it was just controlling Santos up against the cage and then also landing some not really all that effective striking. But she was basically able to neutralize Santos up against the cage for a couple of rounds. But in the first round, when Santos still had some energy, she was doing the much better work on the feet. Now, numerically, sure, it's 25 significant strikes to 26, total strikes 31 to 36, but Santos is landing the much more damaging strikes. So the question in this fight is going to be, for me, how does Fiorot's gas tank hold up against the wrestling attack of Blanchfield? Because if Fiorot has the cardio to fight off the takedown attempts for Blanchfield for more than 3 rounds, I think she probably wins the decision, maybe even gets a knockout in the early goings of the fight, because I do think Fiorot has a massive advantage on the feet. But there have been some indications that Fiorot does not have the best gas tank. And if that is the case, then I do think Blanchfield takes over in the 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, maybe even gets herself a late submission in this fight. So I'm going to pick Blanchfield to win, but I do think the betting line is too wide. And I think Fiorot also going a little bit underutilized in DFS contests. So if you look at my current exposures, I do have Blanchfield in 59% of lineups, but still I have Fiorot in 41% of lineups where she's projected for 32% ownership. So a fight that I'm nearly all in on here in the main event, but a little bit, well, actually am all in on my current build of lineups, but relative to ownership, going to be overweight to both of them. But don't write off Fiorot just because of all the line movement that we've seen in favor of Blanchfield. Co-main event for this fight, we have Vicente Luque taking on Joaquim Buckley. And it's kind of hard to know what to make of Luque at this point in his career. He's somebody who's been in a ton of wars. He's always been super durable, but he was in a crazy fight against Jeff Neal. And it was the first time we really saw Luque get really, really hurt on the feet, got knocked down twice, and ultimately finished by Jeff Neal. And then after the fight, he had to take a really long layoff because he had a brain bleed. Came back against RDA. We saw a totally different game plan from Vicente Luque following the fight against Jeff Neal and the brain injury that he had. We saw him implement a much more wrestle-heavy game plan, landing 8 takedowns in that fight, ultimately winning a decision over RDA. And I'm interested to see what he's going to do against Joaquin Buckley in this matchup, because if this fight does take place on the feet, you do get a little bit concerned about the durability of Luque, just because of that fight a couple times ago against Jeff Neal, where we did see him get melted in that fight and see him get knocked out. That's something we have not really seen from Luque in the past. He's also getting to be a little bit older now. That's what happens as time passes. You get older. Nobody ever gets younger. So I do get concerned about the durability of Luque at this point in his career. Buckley has pretty vicious knockout power. This is a fight priced in the mid-range. I'm favoring Luque a little bit, just because if he is able to implement that same wrestling-based game plan against RDA, against Buckley, and he's able to avoid the heavy strikes on the feet in the early going, then I do think we could see a pretty good score from Luque, and maybe he's able to get himself a third-round submission, because I do think he has a massive, massive grappling advantage in this fight. People kind of forget how good of a grappler Luque is. He is a black belt. We saw him submit... Where's the fight? He submitted Michael Chiesa. He submitted Tyron Woodley. And those are fighters who you don't typically see. Well, Chiesa gets submitted from time to time, but Tyron Woodley, we never see Tyron Woodley get submitted. And we did see Luque end up finishing Woodley on the mat. Woodley himself is a black belt. So Vicente Luque, now that we're seeing him start to implement more wrestling into his game plan, I could see a late submission being in the cards against Joaquin Buckley. A good fight to target in the mid-range for sure. Luque is also very, very popular. We have a project for 34% ownership. So while I do have 27% of him, that does have me a little bit underweight to Luque, while I have 26% of Buckley, which has me about in line with the field on him. So good fight to target here in the mid-range. It's making up about half my lineups. Next fight here, and some of the fights I have less interest in, I'll try to go over them a little bit quicker. We do have 14 fights on the card. Nothing got canceled at weigh-ins today, so there are a lot of options to choose from. Chris Weidman against Bruno Silva. I love Chris Weidman. There was a point in time where he was one of my favorite fighters to watch, but I mean, just the durability is not there for Weidman anymore. He can't take a shot. He's had some terrible injuries as well. You guys, I'm sure, remember the broken leg against Uriah Hall. So some of these fights, he's beating Jacare Souza, gets finished in the third round. Dominic Reyes KOs him almost immediately. He did have the win over Omari Akhmedov, but Weidman gassed and looked pretty bad in the late stages of that fight. The Uriah Hall fight, that was one where he broke his leg. And then the fight against Brad Tavares, I mean, Weidman was kind of in it, but he was mostly just surviving until the end of the fight. So Bruno Silva, who can hit fairly hard, I think we're going to see him knock out Chris Weidman at some point in this fight. So my preferred play in this fight is, it's got to be Bruno Silva for me. Unless the post-USADA version of the UFC is able to bring back an older version of Chris Weidman. Unfortunately, I don't think he has it in him anymore. Not that he's not still a competent fighter, it's just if he can't take punishment, it ends up being an issue more often than not. So I'm going to take Bruno Silva to win by KO. He's currently in 20% of my lineups. It's about even with the field. One thing that is a little tricky about this slate is that there are a bunch of pretty good-looking pay-up options, and you have to make choices. You can't roster everybody. You can't go heavy on all of them just because of the amount of options there are to choose from. So somebody in Bruno Silva that I'm opting to be about even with the field on. Next fight here, Nursultan Ruzboev taking on Cedricus Dumas, and Dumas is a fighter that I just don't really like overall, not just because he's somebody who appears to be kind of a garbage person outside of the octagon, but he does not have a fight style that is at all friendly for DFS purposes. He only lands 1.88 significant strikes per minute, 0.77 takedowns, and that's just going to make it hard for him to win most decisions unless he's fighting somebody like Cody Brundage. If you guys remember the Cody Brundage fight, every round started with Brundage just running in, pulling guard, and then Dumas just sitting on top of him and winning in that way. And then the fight against Abu Zaitar, just nothing happened. Dumas landed 34 significant strikes and a takedown. It makes it hard for me to be really interested in this fight. Dumas is like an okay overall game. He could wrestle a little bit. He could strike a little bit. He's a good athlete. But I do think Ruzboev is going to have some pretty big advantages, particularly when it comes to the height. He is 6'5". While there is a longer reach on the Dumas side, Ruzboev does tower over most fighters in this division. It's going to be the case here as well. He also has a big power advantage in this matchup. Ruzboev, we saw him knock out Bruno Ferreira in his last matchup. So I'm picking Ruzboev to win, but not a fight I'm all that interested in just because of Dumas' ability to slow down fights and make it so that almost nothing happens. So Ruzboev is a fighter that I'm planning on being underweight to in the high end. Once again, getting back to the idea that we can't play everybody. He's projected for 34% ownership. As you guys have seen over the course of the last few weeks, this is something that I like to do fairly regularly. If there's a pay-up option that's way more popular than a lot of the other pay-up options, I prefer to go to some of the lower owned options when I do think there's comparable upside there. So I'm going to be underweight to Rusev in the high end, and no real interest for me in Cedric Dumas. Next fight here to talk about, Bill Algeo against Kyle Nelson. And in a lot of ways, some of the stuff I said about Kyle Nelson is going to apply to Cedric Dumas, because Kyle Nelson lands 3.46 significant strikes per minute, 1.15 takedowns, and he has a way of making his fights very boring in the same way Dumas does in his fights. Last fight against Fernando Padilla, 82 significant strikes to 72, no knockdowns, no takedowns or anything. Fight against Blake Builder before that. This was a fight where people were very high on Blake Builder. He was very chalky in DFS. If you guys play Rainmakers, his cards were really expensive for that fight. And what ends up happening? Just about nothing. Kyle Nelson wins a very boring decision, 59 significant strikes to 45. And that's kind of my concern, the matchup against Bill Algeo. Algeo typically fights at a fairly high pace, landing 6.11 significant strikes per minute. But I just don't think you have to do all that much to beat Kyle Nelson. You just have to outwork him a little bit, and you're going to end up getting your hand raised because Kyle Nelson is so risk adverse. So Bill Algeo fights, I typically do like to target. He has great cardio. He typically pushes the pace, but I just don't know that's going to happen against Kyle Nelson because of the way so many of his fights go. So picking Bill Algeo to win, picking him to win by decision, but another fighter on the high end that I'm not overly interested in. Chidi Njokuani taking on Rhys McKee. This is a fight that I think should be a banger. Rhys McKee has only one speed that is constantly moving forward. He puts out a lot of output. He also absorbs a ton of damage. Rhys McKee lands over 6 significant strikes per minute. He absorbs 9.47. Some of those stats a little bit inflated because he did have to fight Khamzat Chimaev in a total beatdown. What are the final stats for that fight? Yeah, Chimaev finished Rhys McKee, outlanding him 40 significant strikes to 0 in the first round before getting the finish there. Then we saw Rhys McKee against Alex Morono absorb 176 significant strikes. Also 3 takedowns against him. Against Ange Loosa last fight, 98 significant strikes by Loosa, 6 takedowns. So here's what's going to happen, in my opinion, in this fight against Chidi Njokuani. We're going to see the normal deal. Rhys McKee moving forward, throwing a lot of output out there, absorbing a lot. But Chidi Njokuani is cut down to 170 pounds. It's not something we've seen him do in a little bit. And something that I think is probably not all that advised medically. There was a report I read that Chidi Njokuani it was vocal cord issues. He did damage to his vocal cords from weight cutting. I don't know how the human body works, but that seems suboptimal. If the fact that you've cut so much weight that it impacts your ability to speak later on in your life. But either way, Njokuani has gone from 185 pound back down to 170. One of the issues of there being 15-pound gaps between weight classes is that Njokuani is probably somewhere in between. He'd probably be best suited for like 175 pounds, but it doesn't exist. So he has to cut all the way down to 170. He's going to be quite a bit bigger than Rhys McKee just from a physicality standpoint. But I do worry about the cardio of Njokuani when you consider that he is now 35 years old, turns 36 later on this year, hasn't made the cut down to 170 pounds in a little bit. So in the early going, I'm favoring Njokuani all day in this matchup. But if it gets extended into the second and third rounds, I don't know how his cardio is going to look. We've seen cardio issues with him in the past. Rhys McKee pushes a pace. So I think it's either Njokuani early or Rhys McKee late. And McKee historically has had very, very good durability. The one time we saw him stopped in the UFC against Khamzat Chimaev, it was really just because he got checkmated by Chimaev. He got trapped on the ground. Chimaev was raining punishment on him. It wasn't like he got knocked out cold or anything like that. So I actually am going to pick Rhys McKee to win this fight. I'll pick him by decision. And I like targeting this fight a whole bunch, though. I currently have Chidi Njokuani in 30% of my lineups. I got Rhys McKee in 43%. And this is not a fight projected for a ton of ownership. We've got McKee projected for 15% ownership. We've got Njokuani a little bit more popular at 22%. Rhys McKee, one of the highest upside value options on the entire slate, in my opinion. Should be a great fight to watch and a great one to target for DraftKings purposes as well. Jamal Emers taking on Nate Landwehr. And Nate Landwehr fights also typically end up being fairly fun and entertaining. He lands 6.14 significant strikes per minute. Jamal Emers 5.1. Now, with that said, Jamal Emers fights often are not the best scoring for DFS purposes. He's also a very low IQ fighter. We've seen multiple times Jamal Emers has been in fights where you're watching, you go, I think Jamal Emers is the better fighter, but he ends up losing because some boneheaded mistakes that he ends up making. We saw it in the fight against Pat Sabatini, where Jamal Emers had Pat Sabatini nearly out on his feet, but then gets into a grappling situation with Pat Sabatini and gets himself submitted. So on the record, this is a fight that he lost by submission in less than 2 minutes, but Jamal Emers probably should have won that fight. The fight against Giga Chikadze, it was a split decision. I did score the fight 29-28 for Jamal Emers in real time, but Jamal Emers landed 2 takedowns. He had a really big wrestling and grappling advantage over Giga Chikadze in that fight. He just never really implemented it, or when he did, it was too late in that fight. If you go ahead and you look at the stats, you'll see that in the first round, no takedown attempts for Jamal Emers. In the second round, lands a takedown and got a minute 26 seconds of control time. And then the third round also landed a takedown. And at this point, too, Giga was fairly tired. So the significant strikes were 13-32. And a lot of that was because of the wrestling that Jamal Emers put out there. If Emers would have wrestled more in the first round, I think he would have won that fight pretty handily, but unfortunately didn't. And also that means it's kind of hard to trust the game plan of Jamal Emers. So as far as the matchup against Nate Landwehr, I think Emers is the better fighter everywhere. It's just what kind of decisions is he going to end up making in the octagon, which is why I do think that Nate Landwehr is a live underdog. And when Nate Landwehr ends up winning his fights, he scores well because of the amount of output he puts out there. He lands over a takedown per 15 minutes. He lands 6 significant strikes per minute. So I do think Jamal Emers is the better overall fighter. I'm picking him to win by decision. Nate Landwehr is very tough. He's a fighter who's difficult to put away. But my preferred DFS play in this fight is going to be Nate Landwehr, even though I am picking Jamal Emers to win, because I do think a win from Landwehr is much more likely to land in an optimal lineup than a win for Jamal Emers. And getting back to the rest of the fights on the card, we've got Virna Jandiroba taking on Luque Godinez, another fight that I think we could kind of write off for the card. It's overall probably my least interesting fight for DFS purposes. It's also one of my least favorite fights to watch on the card because Lupe's a very good wrestler, but she doesn't always have to utilize it because she's also a competent striker. And one thing that I think we're going to see in this matchup is there's no reason for Luque to go for the takedowns. If this fight takes place on the feet, I think Luque wins this all day over Jandiroba. But if it gets to the mat, then I think that there's a pretty big grappling advantage for Jandiroba, and that's where Luque could get herself in trouble. So if I'm game planning this fight for Luque, I'm just saying, hey, don't shoot takedowns. Keep this fight on the feet, which is kind of the inverse of what we normally say breaking down a Luque fight. So go wrestle, try to get the fight to the ground, get yourself top control time. That's not what I think you want to see from her in this fight. She wants to keep the fight on the feet, use her wrestling for defensive purposes, and win a striking decision. And in that kind of fight, I don't think there's all that much upside. She lands 4.31 significant strikes per minute. Virna Jandiroba landing 2.34. So this is a fight that I'm going to have very minimal exposure to. I assume that in my run of sims here, I've got Luque in 11% of lineups, Jandiroba in just 4.7% of lineups. It's a fight that I really, really don't have much interest in playing for DFS purposes. Going to pick Luque to win. Think she wins by decision. Not a great fight to target, though. Julio Arce against Herbert Burns. A lot was made of Julio Arce missing weight today. The reason a lot was made of it was twofold. First of all, Julio Arce, formerly a 135-pound fighter, so he was somebody who had struggled making weight at 135, so he moves up to 145. And then what happens at 145? Well, he misses weight at 145 pounds also. But not only did he miss weight at 145 pounds, he weighed in over the limit. He got extra time to make the weight cut, went back, took the extra time to make weight, came back and was even heavier than he was the first time. Now, a lot of people are making a big deal out of it. What I think probably happened here, though, is not that he went back and started eating or hydrating or anything like that, because it's only like a half-pound difference. I think it was more human error on the scales, but it is a little bit concerning. He wasn't able to make weight even after a second attempt, especially considering that he was moving up a weight class. That aside, massive advantages in this fight, in my opinion, for Julio Arce against Herbert Burns, and those are in 2 areas: cardio and striking. Herbert Burns has very poor durability. He also has very poor cardio. Usually we see out of Herbert Burns, he pushes a pace early. If he doesn't get a finish in the first couple minutes or so, he starts to fade and gets finished himself in the second or third round. So while there is a big grappling advantage for Herbert Burns, it's hard to imagine him getting the fight to the mat because Julio Arce has a 95% takedown defense. So it's dependent on Herbert Burns, who's not the best wrestler in the world, to land takedowns against a fighter who has 95% takedown defense. And then on top of that, if Herbert Burns does get a takedown, he has to get that finish in the first round or else he's going to end up tiring out. So Julio Arce, I'm picking him to win by a second round knockout as well. The problem with Arce, though, is he's very expensive at $9,500. And considering all the other fighters that we have to pay up for on the slate, he's somebody I was finding a difficult time to get to. So I have Julio Arce in 24% of lineups. Actually, not quite as low as what I thought it was when I was looking earlier. I did make some alterations to some of the ROI boosts in here just to change some of the fighters around to more gear my lineups towards the fighters I want to target. But either way, Julio Arce, I'll have him in some lineups, pick him to win by KO, but really hard for me to get to him as like a core piece of my lineups because those 9,500 fighters typically are hard to build lineups around. Dennis Bookia against Connor Matthews. It's really hard to know how good Bookia is because if you look at his time within the octagon, he had 2 fights in the Contender Series. He didn't look particularly great in either of those fights. The fight against Melsik Bagdasaryan, he lost. Bagdasaryan, somebody who's like ends up being a lower level fighter in the UFC. And then he fights Calio Romero, gets the decision win, but only lands 49 significant strikes over the course of 3 rounds. Then we see him get into the UFC, take on Sean Woodson, lose a fight there. And then his last fight, he fights against Jamal Evers and gets knocked out in 49 seconds. So fights Woodson on late notice. That's kind of a difficult matchup. Hard to know what to make of that. And then he got the fight against Jamal Evers where he loses in 49 seconds. So it's hard to know how good Dennis Bookia is. And then as far as Connor Matthews goes, kind of the same deal. We don't really have a lot of information on him either. We saw him fight twice on the Contender Series. He did land 7 takedowns against Jair Farias, so that's a positive note in terms of the idea that he has some wrestling upside in his fights. And then he lost to Francis Marshall and ceded 6 takedowns in that matchup. So I don't really know what to make of this fight in between Bookia and Matthews. I think these are 2 very low-level fighters. I don't think either of them belong in the UFC. We have seen both of them land takedowns at times. The Matthews fight where he did land the 7 takedowns on the Contender Series is certainly of note and does make me lean a little bit more towards the Matthews side, just from a standpoint of if he is willing to go out and shoot those takedowns, that is something that could potentially score well for DraftKings purposes. So I'll pick Matthews to win. It's not a fight I want to be massively invested in, though, because it's a low-level fight and I don't have a great read on it either. Ibo Aslan taking on Anton Turkali. This is one of my overall favorite fights to target on the card. It also should be a really fun one to watch. I think it's a very binary matchup where also we've seen this matchup happen before in the past. Aslan fights very aggressive in the first round, and I think part of it's because he has very poor cardio and he knows it. Think of him kind of like Ion Cutelaba, right? A fighter who, also same weight class, 205 pounds, goes balls to the wall for the first 5 minutes and basically either gets a finish in those 5 minutes or isn't able to get the finish and then just loses because his cardio isn't able to hold up over 15 minutes. Aslan, that's exactly what he is. And we saw that in the first matchup against Turkali, where Aslan came out really hard in the first round, hurt Turkali, nearly finished him, and then was just totally death gas by the time the second round came around and ends up getting finished. And that's how I think this fight plays out. If Aslan wins, it's probably a first round finish. If he doesn't get that first round finish, then Turkali probably comes back and finishes him in the second or third round. And what I really like about this fight for a DFS perspective, we only have 12% projected ownership going to Turkali. Aslan, on the other hand, is projected to be uber popular at 30%. I do like being overweight to both sides of it, but there's so much leverage on Turkali. If this ownership holds until tomorrow where Turkali is going to be barely over 10% owned, I mean, we've already seen this matchup once. We saw Turkali win by a second-round finish in a fight that would have scored fairly well for DraftKings purposes if it wasn't a fight that took place on the regional scene. So I'm going to pick Turkali to win, and a lot of exposure to me on both sides of this fight. I've got nearly 90% exposure to it. If you're just playing one lineup in a single entry, Turkali is one of my favorite leverage plays that we have on the slate. Super low ownership as well. So that's somebody sub 8K that's going to be in a lot of my lineups. Few more fights left to talk about. Victoria Dudakova against Melissa Gatto. Another fight that I'm not super interested in targeting. Coming into the UFC, Dudakova had a good amount of hype behind her, and it was something that I don't really think was all that warranted. She had an inflated line against Jinyu Frey because of the finish she had over Estela Nunes, but it was such a fluky finish. If you guys saw the fight against Nunes, Dudakova shoots a takedown, and then it was, I don't even know exactly, maybe she broke her arm or dislocated Nunes. It was very disgusting. It was like her arm bent inside out, just bent the wrong way. Like if your arm usually bends this way, hers bent completely in the opposite direction at the elbow. So it was pretty gross to watch, but nothing happened in the fight. And then all of a sudden you see Dudakova be a massive favorite over Jinyu Frey just because of Nunes's arm dislocating in her first fight in the UFC. And then Dudakova fought a very competitive decision against Jinyu Frey. She won, but it was a very, very narrow decision. And now she's fighting against Melissa Gatto. It's going to be the toughest matchup of her career. I'm picking Gatto to win. There's a lot of concerns I have overall on the upside of both sides of this fight, both for real-life purposes and for DFS purposes. I don't think either of these fighters are ever going to be contenders. nor do I ever think these are fighters that we should expect to score all that well for DraftKings purposes outside of something crazy happening like Dudakova fighting Nunes and Nunes' arm just snapping in half 30 seconds into the fight so that Dudakova gets a quick win bonus. But at least per the numbers, neither of them really land significant strikes at a high rate. Both of them also defend takedowns poorly. 1.18 takedowns landed per 15 minutes for Gatto, and Dudakova only has 50% takedown defense. Gatto only has 63% takedown defense. Dudakova lands 2.45 significant strikes. So if either of these fighters opt to shoot takedowns, I think they could land them and hold top control time, but just neither of them are active enough for me to really want to target them for this card, especially 14 fights. It's hard for me to imagine either of them being optimal outside of a really fluky scenario. Andre Petroski against Jacob Malcun. I'm kind of surprised this is one of the first fights on the card because I think it's one of the best fights on the card. And Jacob Malcun is a fighter who I'm almost always going to be interested for DraftKings purposes because of his ability to land takedowns in mass. He landed 8 takedowns against Abdulrazak Alhassan. He landed 6 takedowns against AJ Dobson, 7 against Brendan Allen, 9 against Nick Maximov. And then the fight against Cody Brundage. This was a fight that Malcun really should have won, but unfortunately, he landed some illegal blows in what was basically going to be a finishing sequence for Malcun. He nearly had Brundage finish, but some of the shots came to the back of the head of Cody Brundage. Referee steps in, and then it ends up being a disqualification for Jacob Malcun. But for all intents and purposes, if we're just talking about the skill level of the fighters in the matchup, we should consider that a win for Jacob Malcun. Not saying it should be a win on his record, but the way we evaluate him, we should come out of that fight and say Jacob Malcun was much better. In the early going of this fight, Andre Petroski is certainly going to be dangerous when the fight is taking place on the feet and also in the early stages of the fight. But we've seen Petroski have cardio issues. Not the first fighter I brought that up with on this card, but if you guys watched when he was on The Ultimate Fighter, Andre Petroski, there was a fight where, and he was considered to be one of the most talented overall fighters on that Ultimate Fighter series, but we never really seen him in an extended fight. And then all of a sudden, the first time he was in a fight that went past the first round, we saw him fatigue very, very heavily. And this is a matchup where that could be very problematic against Jacob Malcun and his wrestling pressure. And if we do not see an early finish from Petroski, I do think that Malcun just takes over with the wrestling, with the takedowns, with the cardio, with the pace and pressure, and puts up a big DraftKings score. So Jacob Malcun is somebody who I'm going to be prioritizing for this fight. I have him in 39% of my lineup. So as far as the pay-up options go, Malcun's my favorite overall pay-up option on the slate because of his fight style. Final fight that we have to talk about here. And all right, kept it under 30 minutes, so made a pretty good time here. Didn't want it to go too long. Calvin Laughren taking on Angel Pacheco. And as far as Pacheco goes, you could see here only 33% takedown defense. When we saw him fight on the Contender Series, he only was able to stuff 1 out of 3 takedowns from Danny Silva. If you guys remember, Danny Silva was a fighter that we were on as a punt play a couple of weeks ago, ended up putting up a pretty decent performance against Josh Cooleybaugh by landing 4 takedowns in that spot. And in this matchup, I'm going to be looking back at that fight to say that I have some concerns with Pacheco's takedown defense. And Laughren is somebody who I think is going to be aggressive, looking to shoot takedowns. In his UFC debut against Taylor Lapilus, Laughren landed 2 takedowns, but he attempted 11 of them. If you attempt 11 takedowns in this matchup from Laughren, I do think he lands a handful of them against Angel Pacheco, and that's probably going to be the path to victory for Laughren. As long as he's able to avoid getting into any kind of trouble on the feet, I think he's able to get a pretty good wrestling pace going and wins in that manner. So Laughren, another fighter who I do like getting to a little bit here, 28%. He's my second most roster pay-up option behind Jacob Malcun, and one of the reasons that I do like Laughren for this card, low ownership, only 13% projected ownership going to Laughren for a fighter whose clearest path to victory is a wrestling-based game plan. That could score very well for DraftKings purposes at low ownership. So contrarian play that I'm liking at the high end is Laughren, my second overall favorite pay-up option behind Jacob Malcun. So guys, that is going to do it for today's breakdown. If you haven't done yet, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget, fun game for this week. Let me know below which fighter is going to score the least fantasy points on the card. I'm going to randomly pick one person who gets the answer right to give you a free subscription to OddsShopper, our betting site. And remember, the winner from last week was YouTube Streets Official. So YouTube Streets Official, reach out to me on Twitter so I could send you a link to get you that free subscription. Other than that, guys, good luck. Hope you all make some money this week. We'll see you back here next weekend. Peace out.